Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Yachty podcast, where we spill the jams and spill the tea. And this week, we're coming at you with a brand new episode where we talk about news and what has been happening this week, what we've been listening to, any goings on in the world of music. But before we get started, a little bit of noteworthy information is that we recently on our YouTube channel have surpassed 2,000 subscribers.
Yep.
Thank you all,
Ev-
each and every one of you, especially to the 330 of you who joined on board with us in the last month. Oh my God. Wow. I
What
can't
it
think
do?
about that without feeling a little existential,
Where'd you come
frankly.
from?
this recent surge in
Who are you?
numbers, we
How
still
did
don't
you
know
learn?
we still don't know exactly what caused it. I think that
Does he know?
finally the most likely explanation, the explanation I hope is true, is that our consistency in uploading as well as our diversity in content has meant that the algorithm has finally noticed us to some degree anyway, and is starting to reward us for our consistency, which is really really nice. Because we've had this uptick that started like mid-December, I think, maybe even earlier, and it just hasn't stopped since then, which has just kind of been really
Yep.
crazy. So thank you to anyone who has joined us in that time. We hope that you stick around. We hope you really really enjoy what we do as well. And if you have ideas for things you want us to do, don't be afraid to reach out as well. And of course, thank you to the people who've been with us, our day oneers or even our day tours, anyone who's been with us for any significant amount of time as well. We are still so entirely grateful to you, and we hope that you still enjoy what we do as much as you did when you first hit subscribe. And if you have ideas as well, please of course let us know. A big special thank you as well to everyone who has hit the join button as well, the very special people close to us who have continued to support us in that way as well. Anyone who's ever done anything so much as hit the like button on one of our videos, we owe to you to some extent where we're at now. When we started the Jams and Tea podcast, when we started that in this channel, I believe the channel had about 600 subscribers around that time. Then I looked back at this, we got to 1,000 in, I think it was October 2021. And so now in January 2023, we're at 2,000. So like it took this podcast like 15, 16 months to get from 600 subscribers to 1,000, just a 400 subscriber increase. And then in just over a year, we have done a whole another 1,000. And if this sort of uptick and rate continues, then who knows when we'll be at 3,000. It's an exciting thing to think about. And so, we're really just looking forward to whatever the future holds, basically. And just, insanely, insanely grateful. So let's kick this off as we are doing now within this new format, talking about whatever is new in the world of music. There's actually not been a lot of new activity in terms of like album announcements and things like that compared to last week where we had heaps to talk about. So I'll go through a few things fairly quickly here. One thing that I thought was quite notable is that obviously I think it was the start of last year, I want to say, that Daft Punk officially broke up, and now we have the announcement that one half of Daft Punk, the great Thomas Bangalter, who's one of my favorite names in all of music, is announcing his debut solo album, Mythologies. He has done score work as well for a number of different films and projects. He's always been very active musician, but I'm really excited to see whatever his new solo album brings. And just whatever Thomas and I think Guy is the other one, whatever they end up doing musically now that Daft Punk has officially come to an end, is really, really exciting. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this takes shape. That was one particularly exciting announcement. Another one we got recently is that Tim Hecker has a new album on the way. And I feel like I wasn't talking about this on the podcast, but I feel like I was talking about this in our group chat fairly recently. I was like, man, we're really due for another Tim Hecker record. It's been like 5 years since Konoyo, which is his amazing last record, which I always felt was really underrated for the really exciting things it did, the way it bridged his drone and ambient soundscapes with Japanese gagaku music and orchestration. Always an artist who's innovating and doing really interesting things. So super hyped to see whatever this new album ends up sounding like. I actually, I've just had such an insane week. I haven't gotten around to listening to the single yet. The new album is called No Highs, and it is out on the 28th of August. He also did the score for Infinity Pool, the new Brandon Cronenberg film. So that's exciting. Really looking forward to that. Some interesting news items this week. We had not the announcement, we had the release of a new Lil Yachty album, which would not really be all that newsworthy or relevant to us if it weren't a bizarre pivot into psychedelic rock. Now, none of us have heard it yet, but we are going to review it next week as well. So stick around for that. We're going to be talking about Lil Yachty's pivot into psych rock. Really intrigued to see where that goes and what that does and how Lil Yachty applies himself to that. Is it going to be an actually interesting and surprising and powerful sort of pivot into an artist broadening their range? Or is it going to be like a Lil Wayne? What's the name of the Lil Wayne album? Where he
is it like something?
It's something.
Revival.
Rebirth, I think. It might be Rebirth. You know, the one where he suddenly decides to do pop punk or whatever. Is it going to be a Lil Wayne Rebirth or a Kid Cudi Speedboat to Heaven? I'm hopeful that it won't be, but Lil Yachty is an artist that gets a lot of shit and gets shit on a lot. But also is this person who has this relentless attitude of confidence and positivity and just a love of creating art that for me makes him a hard person to hate, even if I don't like his music, just because he always approaches the music that he makes in a really earnest way. So we'll see how that turns out. One news item this week that stuck out to me is I don't know if either of you saw this, the great Rick Astley of Never Gonna Give You Up has sued Young Gravy for imitating his voice on a new song of his, I'm guessing. Look, do either of you have any idea who Young Gravy is? I feel like 50 years old. I've never heard of this guy. Is this like a TikTok thing?
I heard this song because of Todd in the Shadows. It was like an honorable mention on his worst list, I think.
And what did
all I know about him is there's a podcast I frequently listen to with stand-up comedians Trevor Wallace and Michael Blaustein called the Stiff Socks Podcast, and Mr. Gravy has made a handful of appearances on said podcast. As far as I know, his music is like the typical sort of pop rap thing.
He just gives me like weird.
It did not strike me as very good.
He gives me like, I'm just looking at this picture of him and just everything surrounding this. He just gives me like weird, like it's like a cross between Lil Dicky and Mac DeMarco. Like it's just this.
That's
like,
probably about right.
This white rapper chic thing, but also crossed with this sort of like trailer trash aesthetic. That is like owes a lot more to like that sort of bastion of lower Americana. I have no idea what his music sounds like. I've never heard consciously heard any of it, but the fact this is just a great headline. Rick Astley sues Young Gravy for imitating his voice, like not for like sampling him in a way that wasn't cleared or just for imitating his voice. I love that.
Richard, you can't sue somebody for imitating you. That's not how that works.
Another story that I really liked, just because it's not a story that I like, it's just a headline that I found really, really funny. And the 1975, who we've talked about many times, are great at generating funny headlines. Matt Healy and the band are just great at doing stupid things that generate really funny headlines at their shows. And the latest one that they've done,
I want you to stop saying odd shit.
Maybe my favorite thing that he's done yet is at a recent 1975 show, Matt Healy kind of announced to the crowd that he was going to bring on Harry Styles to sing a song with them, and got the crowd, their audience, teenage girls, whatever, completely, absolutely going nuts. And instead, he brought out Lewis Capaldi.
Oh no, not Harry Styles at home. Oh,
it's the best way I've ever heard him be described. He brought out Lewis Capaldi, and they did a cover of Taylor Swift's Love Story. together, which is just the funniest thing in the world that I can
I
possibly imagine.
I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that of popular like musicians in the greater world of pop music, Louis Capaldi has my least favorite vocal presence of literally all of them. Just this bellowing anguish. It sounds like I'm listening to someone being slowly like squished underneath a boot heel.
It's like, Lewis Capaldi, I feel for him because he's just like more than any of these other like random, massively successful, Gen Z era stars. Like he just is a guy, like
He's just a guy.
he looks like, Joe whoever. Like, and he is
way too ugly to be famous. God love him.
Yeah, exactly. And I kind of feel for him being in that situation because it's like he's going to live forever in the shadow of Ed Sheeran, who is the English boy who has nothing really going for him aesthetically, yet somehow manages to be the biggest star in the world and completely, the peak of, the just someone who is lusted after essentially by every girl in existence, despite being this specky ginger cunt. And Louis Capaldi has got to live in that shadow forever, so I really feel for him. It's not a fun situation to be in. Another story that, well, not story, but another thing that happened this week, and I think this may be just something that only I am really all that into, and I think this is just maybe, and it's not because you two wouldn't be into it. I've just never heard you talk about it, so I assume maybe it just flew under the radar for you. But this week was the 20th anniversary of the album Mary Star of the Sea by the band Zwan. Zwan is a supergroup that Billy Corgan formed in the early 2000s after the first dissolution of Smashing Pumpkins. It's a supergroup, contains members of Slint. David Payo from Slint was in that band. Matthew Sweeney from Chavez is in that band. Just a band full of like great musicians. They put out one album and then completely disbanded because Billy Corgan felt undermined. Of course, that was the reason why they disbanded.
Jesus Christ, Billy.
But if you haven't heard this, and actually I don't blame you if you haven't heard it, it's never been on streaming, so you've got to listen to it on YouTube if you want to hear it. It's a great record. Like, it's a really strong record.
I gotta check this out.
It's really fun. It's really lightweight, but also at the same time, it's this vision of what Smashing Pumpkins could have gone on to do if Billy just didn't completely tunnel inside himself so deeply from the, Adore era onward. If they had stayed in that kind of starry-eyed space of just, the possibilities of music and not just completely tunneled into this dark abyss that they never really got out of. The Zwan album is just a perfect example of what you would want the Smashing Pumpkins and Billy Corgan to kind of continue to be. I mean, there's a song on this album that's called Baby Let's Rock. And then the next song on the album is called Yeah, with an exclamation mark. And that's kind of it. Like, there's no sense of pretension here. It's really down to earth. It's really musically, great. And it's just free of the constraints of, a massive project like Smashing Pumpkins. And it's kind of become a little bit of a cult classic ever since then. Like, so yeah, check it out as well. Jimmy Chamberlain plays on it. Paz Lenchantin from Perfect Circle and Silver Jews is on it as well, and Pixies more recently. So yeah, a great record that a lot of people are becoming aware of now that it's finally turned 20.
I should have been more aware of this, but my God, the names of Billy's solo albums. Siddhartha, Aegea, Ogulala, Cotillion.
I've always been like fond of, and by fond I mean like disdainful of, but also in a way where it's like kind of endearing how pretentious it is. The album cover and title combination of The Future Embrace.
The cover is fucking hysterical.
Like, just this like Billy Corgan just forever wanting to be like a 16-year-old goth girl and never fully achieving that, being so down the libertarian rabbit hole that he's unable to see the true freedom that he might have experienced if he could have transitioned.
Bald Gerard way.
There's an alternate universe where Billy Corgan did transition and probably still made terrible music, in the 21st century. But I just want to see the world in which Billy Corgan didn't get suckered down the rabbit hole of libertarianism. Anyway, we also had the Oscar nominations this week. I just feel obligated to bring this topic up. Do you two have any thoughts on the Oscar nominations this year?
I mean, like, I thought that it's largely solid for the most part.
It's mostly pretty good. Cinematography is
disaster,
a fucking disgrace. I mean,
awful. I mean, no Fablemans is already bad enough, but like, yeesh.
Nope. No.
Nope got completely shut out. No Decision to Leave, like,
yeah. It was like, I thought that the nominations were fairly, as far as the Oscars go, it was like, my feelings are mixed to positive, which feels like kind of how I felt about the nominations fairly consistently for the last 5 or so years. There's not really
it's better than last year.
Yeah, like last year wasn't great, but like I don't think there's been a terrible year for nominations in a while now, but there hasn't been a great year either. It's just been kind of fairly middling in this place. Although it's worth noting, just in terms of the world of music, that Mitski, Rihanna, and Lady Gaga all received Oscar nominations this year. So one of those is on track for the next step in their EGOT. I want to see Mitski.
No LCD sound system, though.
No LCD sound. That's a real snub. Like
that sucks.
Like, just not only how great that song is, New Body Rumba, but also just how well it's used in the movie White Noise. I talked about it when we talked about our favorite films of 2022. It's just, that one really stung for some reason, even though it wasn't like surprising, like terribly surprising. It didn't get a nomination. I was just kind of like holding out a little bit of hope that it would.
Get James Murphy his EGOT.
Yeah. So
please.
But so they're fairly fine as well. I know that Twitter loves to discourse certain films into oblivion, and that's just the nature of what Twitter is. But I feel like that regardless of where you fall on this particular film, it seems to me to be almost unquestionably a net positive that Everything Everywhere All at Once has done as well as it has done in these nominations.
Yeah, I mean,
just everything about what that movie has done, and
Quan and Yo are like they each have a really good chance of winning their respective categories.
Yeah, just so much about what that movie has done. Again, regardless of how you feel about it, that's, I think, animated and inspired a lot of passion for the possibilities of cinema, and it represents kind of like it's a really nice totem that represents the kind of maximalist sort of era of cinema being made by people from the younger generation now that we're gonna, I assume, see a lot more of in the years to come. And so it's just nice to see it be acknowledged, because it's just such a modern film in so many different ways. And the Oscars are such a, aggressively traditionalist institution that it's really kind of sort of transgressive even for this to be the most nominated film at the Oscars. And that to me is a pretty bold step forward for them in terms of like actually being, representative of what cinema is in the modern era. So there's a lot of regressive stuff in the Oscar nominations, a lot of bizarre omissions, as there always are. But that to me is the big standout. The fact that that film is the most nominated, that to me feels like, genuine progress for the Academy, in as much as they can make progress or will make progress. Really, really think that's really, really awesome. All right, so that's really all we have to report on in terms of new music and new album announcements. Let's get into our main discussion for today, which is kind of off of the back of celebrating 2,000 subscribers. We were thinking, what's something we can do to mark this occasion, some way in which we can kind of be a little bit more reflective and a little bit more kind of talking about ourselves a little bit, or our tastes and our histories even. And I thought it might be cool to talk about albums that we bought when we were younger, even the first album we ever bought, if we have that still, or just records that we've owned for a long time that kind of take us back to where we were at a younger age, what we valued in music, what kind of person we were in terms of taste when we bought it, and that sort of thing. So I want to see what records you guys have picked. It's okay if you only picked one. I kind of left it purposefully vague if people wanted to pick, a handful. But what do you guys have in terms of the first album you ever bought, or one of the first albums you ever owned, and what that means to you now?
The first album that I can remember, hearing about or hearing songs from and going, I have to have this, was completely unsurprisingly, if you know me, and I think I've said this a handful of times, as Green Day's American Idiot. Um,
Yeah.
which is Green Day in general were really the first band that ignited a passion for music in me in seventh or eighth grade. I'm of the age where I bought it on iTunes, but then later picked up the vinyl record, which I think was also the first vinyl record I added to my collection when I started. An album that I certainly don't love as, vigorously as I did then, but as a sort of stepping stone of where I approach music from and how I think about it, and just still a lot of the stuff that I love to this day, a lot of it stems from that. And I think the second album I'll mention uh, is is not really one so much I bought, but one I remember seeing in my parents' iTunes collection and really embracing. Was actually the Foo Fighters' greatest hits album,
Oh yeah.
which uh, really is like up there with Credence's greatest hits album in terms of just like front to back, nothing but some of the best songs of their kind. Like I can basically throw this on as an album and listen to it all the way through, and it's an essentially flawless experience. And a lot of that is tied into how young I was when I first listened to it, like with American Idiot. But even more so than American Idiot, I would say the songs on there and the albums that I would go on to listen to that had these songs really are just like unimpeachable to me. They're also like really interesting for rock songs. I mean, I feel like Foo Fighters is the rock band that people point to. But The Pretender is, for instance, is just such a like consistently engaging and interesting song structurally and sonically. Like I can't think of anyone who would think up that riff other than Dave Grohl, and it's so propulsive and fun and invigorating. Yeah, that band has just such a unique and particular way of writing the biggest rock hits of the 21st century. That album is basically front to back perfect.
Awesome. Jake, do you want to go next?
Yeah. It's very weird just because I did actually collect CDs before I started getting vinyl. Like that was the first collection I ever really pursued. And it was mainly because I already had a couple of CDs that I got either from my mom or of my own accord. Amusingly enough, the first CD I actually ever bought is not an album or a greatest hits at all. It was the soundtrack to Disney's Treasure Planet. I listened to that on my little Walkman all the time as a child because I don't know, there's nothing more autistic I could possibly fathom, I guess. But the first proper album I ever obtained. I didn't buy it just because this was given to me by my mom, but the first album that I ever had in my own possession was Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. Which, I mean, like, it's a heartland rock slash synth pop kind of classic album. It was, I think, the first album I ever really paid conscious attention to when it comes to like the actual track list of it, and that being like sequencing being an important element of an album, just because I remember just maybe not even consciously, but being like, wow, this album just like flows together really nicely. And I still think that it's not one of my like absolute favorite Bruce Springsteen records, but I mean, it's got Born in the USA, it's got I'm on Fire, Downbound Train, Glory Days, and Dancing in the Dark, all of which I have super fond memories of. When I was a little kid, we listened to that in the car all the time. And especially, I remember we drove down to Florida one year, and this CD, along with the greatest hits of Michael Jackson, basically soundtracked the entire trip down there. So I just have really fond associations of this album in my memory. And just generally speaking, it was sort of the foundation for the start of my collection. But I think the first CD that I ever truly bought is an album that I feel like could only have existed as a CD. Like, I know it was released on vinyl, but to me, this is such a quintessentially CD era album and a CD era project. And that being another one that's aged particularly well, and that being Rockin' the Suburbs by Ben Folds. This is thankfully one of the albums that I bought the earliest on, purely because of the single Rockin' the Suburbs. And the reason I became aware of that was because of the animated film Over the Hedge, because this film uses Rockin' the Suburbs in it, except it's a cover of Rockin' the Suburbs that is really oddly just sounds exactly the same as the Ben Folds version. Like, the band that do the cover do almost nothing to it other than change the lyrics, because, you know, some of them have naughty words in them. But I remember seeking out that song and loving it. And, you know, as a kid, I never really caught on to the fact that Rockin' the Suburbs is this very highly satirical, very tongue-in-cheek song.
Same. I never had the intelligence to pick that up as a little kid either. It just seemed like a really dumb rock song from some dumb guy that I loved.
Yeah, he references fucking Quiet Lion in that song, and I was just like, I don't know what that is as a child. And I was like, I know who Michael Jackson is, but then I listened to it and I'm like, this man screams fuck in this song. I like it. And then I just remember seeing the CD and being like, oh, I wonder what else is on this CD. Just because, like, I don't even think I took an active effort to see like the rest of the track list. I just blind bought it.
I'm imagining you, little baby Jake, loving the silly, you know, irreverent, funny rock song Rockin' the Suburbs, getting the CD, then hearing a song like Still Fighting It, and just
oh god, yeah. And that was my reaction largely to it. I mean, you have these songs like Still Fighting It, which are like these, I mean, like they're like really heartbreaking, but just like very quintessentially Ben Foldsian songs. And, you know, as I've grown older, I just kind of love that album more and more. We're actually going to
fucking great album.
It's a record club that we're going to talk about eventually, just because in and of itself, there is so much to unpack with all those songs. But as I've gotten older, the more that like Ben Folds is like novelistic writing, and how that album literally, like every single song in that album is a short story to some extent. And I just remember being really enamored with it, because I was like, it's just sort of opened my eyes to the possibility of storytelling in music. Like, he's talking about all of these named characters on these songs, and not to mention Zach and Sarah became one of my favorite pop songs just fucking ever. One of the best hooks ever. And not to mention, it's like, again, that was a song I never realized was as dark as it was. Then you revisit it and it's like, oh, Ben is writing about a schizophrenic girl who gets like beaten at home. It's a really dark song.
Well,
but it slaps.
It's such jaunty, like piano rock power pop as well. It's like, it disguises that so well.
It's like if Weezer made good music again. That's
I do just want to point out how hilarious it is that I also for the first time heard Rock in the Suburbs on the In Over the Hedge. Um it's just hilarious to me that like a gentrified version of Rock in the Suburbs exists.
It's so fucking funny, man. It doesn't make any.
Like,
It's like if you made a parody of like a Frank Zappa song that's like parodying the Beatles. It's like
a gentrified version of a song that's already like one of the widest songs you could possibly
and is
imagine.
about being gentrified.
Yeah.
let me tell y'all what it's like.
My first
Male middle class and white.
My first
It's
exposure
bitch if you don't believe.
my first exposure to this song was actually not Over the Hedge. It was because
Shame on.
because as I've said many times, and I'll go into a little bit in a bit, my dad constantly had music channels, like channels that just played music videos 24/7 playing on TV. So I discovered this, this song was a song I loved as a little kid because it was like, it's really, funny and funky. And you can imagine, it's really easy for a little kid to listen to this and enjoy it. And I love the music video. It was always the music video that I associated with this really stupid music video where he's just kind of like parodying Limp Bizkit and parodying all these like, frat house sort of like, caricaturish like parodies of like Alien Ant Farm and all that sort of stuff that he was doing. And I didn't pick up on any of that, but it was just funny to see this dude, on a skateboard with a backwards cap. And like, there's this part in the music video where his arms are like really long for some reason. He's playing the piano. And I just remember thinking that was the funniest thing in the world as a kid. But what's also so funny is that I never heard the album until I was like a teenager. I just never sought out the album for whatever reason. It was always just like Ben Folds was the Rock in the Suburbs song guy. And I just never thought to listen to more of his music until I was deep into it. And
same.
What's funny about that is that for so long, the only version of the song I knew was the Ben Folds version, but it was the censored music video version. So in my head, this song never doesn't have any fucks in it, doesn't have any bad words in it. It just has that weirdly, like almost what you might think of as like a purposefully funny silence where they should be. And then you hear the proper song, and you're like, oh no, it is actually there. It was just censored. And I'm used to hearing, it makes me real pissed off, and I just want to say, and then just an extended bleeping noise for 10 seconds.
So good.
But yeah, great song, great album. I love that we all share that song as a childhood memory in some way.
Take the checks and face the facts. Some producer with computers fixes all my shitty tracks.
Yeah, or as I knew it, some producer with computers fixes all my tracks. Anything else you wanted to talk about, Jake?
The only other CD I bought other than that was another quintessentially Jake album, one that I associate with Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA a lot, just because I associate these artists together a lot, which I mean, I guess makes a little bit of sense, but it would be Billy Joel's The Stranger. I had an immense fondness for the music of Billy Joel because of my mom. We listened to his greatest hits a lot. I knew every single lyric to We Didn't Start the Fire by the time I was 7 years old. Could recite them to you from memory. Not sure if I could do it now, but I certainly could when I was in the second grade. But I mean, but again, I knew like every word to songs like Goodnight Saigon, an 8-minute long ballad about going off to Vietnam and dying in war. And it's just a really sad song. But I got The Stranger because another movie tie-in, actually. Holy shit. The movie, because I lived in the household of a single mother, I am incredibly well versed in the world of rom-coms. So of course the first Billy Joel song I became conscious of was Vienna because of its needle drop and 13 going on 30. Which is like, Vienna is legitimately one of the first songs I think I ever cried to because of that movie, just because I associated it with just being sad. But it is like a really great song about like nostalgia and stuff. And The Stranger, in my opinion, it's held in decent esteem now, but The Stranger, in my opinion, is one of those albums that's like, Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, in that I just think every song is just an eternal pop music banger. It's one of the few Billy Joel albums that sort of he stands up to his contemporary friend and rival Elton John with, and that Elton John has this amazing like initial 7 album run of like masterpieces that are just standards of pop music, and Billy Joel was always this guy who kind of had trouble with critics and kind of wanted to be taken seriously but was dismissed, and then had an album like, oh god, is it The Iron Curtain? Is that what it was actually called? Something having to do with curtains. But he released an album. Our friend Hannah once compared the relationship of Billy Joel with the public to the relationship of Taylor Swift with the public, and the Curtain album being folklore comparison wise. And I always found that comparison interesting. But The Stranger is an album that I feel like people like now, but I mean, like, there are songs on there like Moving Out, Anthony's song, which is again a song I know every fucking word to.
Love that song. That's actually my
Music
favorite
for an
song
Italian
on the album.
restaurant. I mean, that's a great fucking song. It's one of those shorter records that's easily able to like kind of digest, and I love the title track as well. There's just a lot of it's a kind of music that was very much like, it was from a world that I didn't like, because I was listening to shit like, the Heartland rock of Bruce Springsteen and what have you, stuff that felt kind of natural for a young Kentuckian to listen to. And Billy Joel is like very city bound. Like he's an artist that's very metropolitan in his aesthetics of his songwriting. So it felt very distant for me to listen to. So it felt sort of formative in terms of me listening to stuff that made me like venture out in terms of what I looked for in terms of songwriting. And I still love that album today. I own it on vinyl.
Yeah, part of me is a little bit like jealous of that experience, because like Billy Joel is a nice representation of, I think, everything that my dad hated musically.
That sounds about right.
He just always liked, Björk and all these artists who were like really esoteric. It was like, electronic stuff, prog, but like really, 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 far out prog. And that was just the way he was. So I never really got the classical, singer-songwriter thing growing up. I had to kind of discover that all on my own. And that is, I think, going to be represented fairly well in my in the earliest albums that I owned. I have a few here, so I'll kind of try and be quick with them. The first album I've talked about, I'll mention very briefly. It's not an album I owned because it's an album my dad owned. But I've talked about it before on the podcast. The first album that my first experience with an album, like as an album, understanding what an album could be, what an album could do, was the Flaming Lips, Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots.
Yeah.
Talked about that when we did our record club on that a million years ago. And that album, in so many ways, like primed me for the album as an experience, and the idea of a record with a concept. The album as some vehicle for an abstract story told through different songs, and all the different things that a record can do sonically, because that album does a lot of things sonically. So that was a really impressionable thing. The first album I ever bought with like pocket money was and I think this is probably true for a lot of people, a pretty bad album, but from an artist that I really loved. So I've talked about this before. One of my favorite artists growing up, an artist I was really into because my dad really liked them, and it was just one of those things that I connected to for whatever reason, was the Chemical Brothers. And I actually own, I don't have with me the album that is the first album I bought, but I have like 3 other records of theirs that I've bought over the years. They're again, iconic CD band as well. You wouldn't want to listen to them any other way. But yeah, the first album they released when I was kind of like, old enough to be interested in owning albums and be able to, was their 2007 record We Are the Night, which is handily the worst album they've ever made. It's the album that has, I seriously doubt either of you remember this, but maybe you will. They had a minor hit on this album with a song called The Salmon Dance, which was just this kind of like really stupid, childish, but like kind of, poking fun song about like talking fish that rap. And it was just, it was just very poorly conceived all around.
What was they cooking?
But look,
salmon.
There's some songs on that record I like, but it's easily their worst record. Thankfully, they really came back in 2010 with Further, which I think is a great album, one of the great sort of comebacks from a really big downturn sort of thing. So yeah, We Are the Night by the Chemical Brothers was technically the first album I ever bought. However, I was gifted other albums as well. One that left a big impression on me as a kid, Primal Scream, Screamadelica. Talked about this a bit when we did our Screamadelica retrospective. This album also huge impression on me as a kid. Completely, I think in a lot of ways, my understanding of what rock music was really influenced by this as well. I was like primed for rock music to be this kind of fusion of, you know, guitars as you would imagine it, but with all these sort of psychedelic things, and the way that they infused electronica into that was really influential on me. Then we have this won't mean anything to any of you, but the second album I think that I ever bought is this record. It's called Truth of the World, Welcome to the Show, by a band called Evermore. They're a New Zealand band. This is like, so New Zealand sort of pop rock band essentially tries to make The Wall, I suppose, is a good analog. Or it's like this big, massive concept album. The Wall's not really good. It's kind of like a 1984 sort of thing, like about how, you know, the media and the government are like trying to essentially, you know, neuter people and
Billy Corgan ass.
Yeah, it's like, it's a very pretentious album, but it's kind of, it does that knowingly. It's not like this kind of album that's like, oh, here's the actual truth. It's kind of like a concept album about that sort of thing. It's really like bombastic and over the top, and it's obviously borrowing so much from like so many classic rock bands. Maybe one day we can do a record club on it or something, because I think it's a really fascinating
Sounds
album.
interesting.
It is really interesting. And it was just made by a couple of boys from Fielding, which is a really tiny town in the North Island, who just, it wasn't their first record. They had a pretty big radio success with one of their earlier records. But this record was just so ambitious and like so extra, and it really left an impression on me. I think a lot of my predisposition to really bombastic extra music is in part comes back to this album and how much it influenced me. Like its concept and all the kind of like, you know, the people are sheep being controlled sort of stuff. It's very kind of like Perfect Circle, actually. It's very pretentious. Like it's incredibly pretentious. And that's something you kind of just have to get over. But also
pretentious is honestly a neutral term. It can mean something good, or I mean, The Wall is fucking pretentious, and that's a 10 out of 10.
Yeah, it's just very lyrically like two-dimensional, but it's a great record. I think it's not a great record, but I love it. That's a good way of putting it. Then you have a record that I don't know if this was probably wasn't the third record I own. I kind of can't really keep track at this point, but a record that I bought that kind of cemented I fell in love with movies, because I fell in love with movies when I was about like 13 years old, and the movie that kind of triggered it was Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, as I'm sure it was for a lot of you know, suburbanite white boys. This movie changed my life as a you know, like budding teenager, and I had to own the soundtrack because I was obsessed with the music. I don't have it with me, but I also actually own the CD of the John Bryan score, which is an amazing score. This is the soundtrack, so the songs by Amy Mann that are in the movie. I listened to this so much when I was 13. I just listened to this constantly.
Me when I was 17.
Like so many of my favorite Amy Mann songs, like Momentum and Driving Sideways and Deathly, are on here, but also, of course, the songs that everyone remembers, Wise Up and Save Me. Just amazing songs, amazing soundtrack.
Me when I was yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, these songs are great, and they haven't aged a day at all. So yeah, that was a big moment for me.
Drop a new album, Queen.
Now we're getting, so that was kind of 13-year-old me sort of getting into puberty and sort of starting to really develop that dramatic streak that I'm sure we all had to some degree.
Getting into puberty.
Yeah, my favorite Mountain Goats album. So that's 13. So now let's move to when I was like 14 going on 15, like the most pretentious hipster era of my, you know, time growing up. And at this point in time in the year 2011, a band that I love very dearly called M83 released their album Hurry Up We're Dreaming, which of course I bought and still own. I don't have it with me because it's in my car right now. But before I bought that, I bought this. Saturdays Equals Youth, which is the album they made right before Hurry Up, We're Dreaming. And look at this album cover for a second. Look at this fucking hipster chic, like the most insufferable fucking losers you've ever seen in your life. Like everything about this is uncool, right? And it just leans so heavily into that.
Designed to have slurs thrown at it.
Like, and you know, these are songs, like there's songs in here like Graveyard Girl and Kim and Jesse that are like, so, you know, like Graveyard Girl has like a spoken word bridge, you know, like I'm 14 and I feel like my life is gonna you know, is gonna explode. And it's so like, it's so that it's that M83 thing of just being like so ridiculously adolescent in every sense, but also like taking that feeling and making it huge. Shoegaze guitars, massive synths, huge digital drums, and the, you know, 8-minute songs, right? This album ends with like an 11-minute static ambient piece because of course it does. But it
Naturally.
also just, this album, this is like one of the albums I've probably heard the most in my life. You know, if you met me when I was 14, I would be like, just, this was my induction into the world of emo, even though it's not really that emo. It's just like really,
cyber emo.
yeah. So this album, you know, even though Hurry Up, We're Dreaming is a better record, not by much, I will say, but it is a better record. This is the album that I was weaned on in terms of getting into my sort of overly emotional, ridiculous era. You know, at the peak of my like, let's check Pitchfork Media to see like what the best albums of all time are. This is the kind of shit I would pick up.
I need to go back and listen to all of M83 stuff because I am like fond of the music that I've heard from them. But with them having a new album this year, I feel like they're primed for me to revisit their stuff.
This is 100% the next one you need to listen to. Absolutely, without a doubt. It's just, I don't know whether you have to just be in that really adolescent space to connect with it the way that I did, but I don't know. It's just synth pop jams, larger than life sound. It's huge.
Look, I the only mood I gotta be in to listen to and appreciate intro and outro on Hurry Up, We're Dreaming is incredibly fucking melancholic.
Yeah, well, they haven't quite reached the level of budget that they had on that album to make the songs that huge, but they are like, emotionally they're there. Even if they haven't quite found the sound to get there yet. There's a lot of like sort of piano ballads, but with like massive synthy atmosphere to them, and just like songs that are just like 1 5-minute shoegaze riff that just gets more and more intense and nothing else. That's the sort of thing on this album.
Yeah, I'm down.
Next, so moving into the kind of 14 to 15-year-old era, just before I had my life irrevocably changed by my first high school girlfriend, and I'll get to that in a second. But just on the precipice of that era was the time when I got really into Sigur Rós. And Jake, you'll be pleased to hear the first Sigur Rós album I ever bought, Valtari. Because this was the album that came out just after I first got into them. And I was obsessed with this album. And I don't want to rehash because it wasn't that long ago that we talked about it in our Sigur Rós video.
Go watch our episode on it. It's
but
good.
I, you know, especially coming off, you know, entering my emo phase with shit like this, you know, it was like my emo phase, but also like not emo at all because I wasn't actually listening to emo music. I was just listening to really emotional
spirit
music.
of emo is in these strongly.
But yeah, you know, just the kind of shit where it's like I would listen to this and just, you know, cry it in my pillow, you know, every night, you know, to Ekimuk and that sort of shit. So, you know, yeah. So that's that. That's
the things you do as a teenager or a 25-year-old.
Yeah. Like this was like, yeah, actually no, for a while this was my favorite Sigur Rós album, but I went through the whole discography in a whirlwind, and you know, my favorite changes fairly regularly, but it's currently the Brackets album, but I still have a special connection with this that is unique. And then I had my life forever changed by meeting a girl. Guy, you know, teenage boy meets girl for first time, you know, like world shifts. But yeah, no, I finally met someone who was more into music than I was when I was like, you know, 15. And one of the albums that she got me into earliest on that I became fixated on was this bad boy, A Storm in Heaven by The
Verve. More
More
jams than T-Core.
Exactly. This was my favorite album of all time when I was 15. I completely adored this. This shit was on constant rotation. It is just every second of this I know in my bones, right? This album is in my DNA. And so of course I had to buy it. 100% pure teenage me core. And the last thing I'll talk about, because otherwise we'll just keep going through my entire biography, but the next step, the biggest way in which this particular person changed and shaped my taste in music was by introducing me, and it's kind of a meme at this point whenever I talk about this time in my life, was that this person introduced me to the Smashing Pumpkins.
Yeah, Melancholy.
And I actually own this. I own Siamese Dream, and I own Pisces Iscariot. But like, this is the most representative one, right? Like, this is the one that, completely paradigm shift, altered everything, changed my entire sort of perspective. What's funny is that I bought this in a used CD store, and I think within 2 or 3 listens and one rip of the
Isn't
album.
that the price sticker still on it?
Yeah, that's not what I paid for it. But yeah, it's I bought this in a used CD store, and within at least 2 or 3 spins and one rip of the album into Windows Media Player, the first disc I think had become like completely corrupted, and wouldn't play anymore. And I've actually never listened to this CD ever since, because, well, for one, I don't need to listen to it on CD, but it is, I will never throw this away, even though one disc doesn't play properly anymore, because it's just the kind of album that you don't want to throw away. You want to have it. And it is so representative of my entire world expanding and my love of music growing, is this point. Just getting from starting out with, just the esoteric dance floor electronica of the Chemical Brothers, and, and all this sort of crazy psychedelic stuff that I was really gotten into as a kid, and then completely entering the world of the pantheon of like classical rock music, kind of having the reverse arc of a lot of people who grow up getting introduced to rock music with records like this, and then getting their tastes get gradually more esoteric. I kind of had a bit of the reverse, and as I grew up, my tastes got a little bit more, well, not basic, because I still loved all that stuff, but I just had to discover a lot of the pantheon stuff later on. And so Melancholy and Infinite Sadness, the moment I bought this, and everything that purchase represents, is like, the end of this arc of me getting into music. It starts with the Flaming Lips and the Chemical Brothers, and it ends here, and the rest is just,
Honestly, around that age, I think that was when I was first introduced to Smashing Pumpkins.
It's the age that every single human being should be introduced to them, if not earlier. But by that point,
it was through Bullet with Butterfly Wings, because that was the theme song to a show my mom watched on the Discovery Channel about crab fishing. I think it was called Deadliest Catch. Yeah, and the theme song was Bullet with Butterfly Wings. And the reason I paid attention is because there is a guy in that show named Jake Anderson. And it was like the worlds collided, and then I like downloaded Bullet with Butterfly Wings on my iPod, and I was just like, this kind of goes. Why does he sound so squeaky?
That's, yeah. No, I remember all of that. I
One hell.
Had so many like random singles ripped onto my MP3 player. And once with that CD corroded, all I had were like my MP3 rips of those songs, and like YouTube rips of other songs as well. But yeah, it's just a fixation. I can picture myself now in school, instead of hanging around swinging off, bars and listening to Zero and shit. It's so,
you're my Zero.
And so much has changed since then, but it's also like so much has not changed, because I'm still here.
I'm still sad.
Yeah, and the albums still make me feel the same way. So that is our breakdown of the first albums that we ever bought. Cool. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode of Jams and Tea Now. We didn't get a chance to talk about much of what we've been listening to recently. We will do that this time next week as well. And of course, stick around for our upcoming record clubs and videos as well. I'm a little hungover, I'm going to be real with you all at home, so I can't remember exactly the sequence of what's out yet and what will be out, but there will be new videos coming, of course, 3 videos every week. Stick around for what's next, and let us know what you would like to see. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel as well if you haven't already. Both of those things help us a lot. Thank you again, of course, to everyone who is subscribed and who does like as well for getting us to this point now where we are at 2,000 subscribers. Still haven't fully processed it. Maybe never will until we get to 3,000 subscribers. Maybe I'll process that we have 2,000 subscribers when we hit 3,000. We'll see what happens. If you want to go above and beyond and support us even more, you can hit the join button on our YouTube page, and for just $1 a month, you can be a direct supporter, a member of the Jams and Tea family. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to listen to as a perk of being a family member, then your recommendation will go right to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, MTV. I want my MTV.